Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part or second half of this lecture. Um, Although I'm probably going to change the schedule a little bit, but I'll talk more about that later. But for now, let's just go straight into the lecture. Okay. So in the previous lecture, we talked about ideology, and we left off on this notion of interpolation. And it seems like in the forums, a lot of you are really doing a good job of understanding this idea of that interpolation is actually what makes you a subject. So instead of being like an individual, you are made a subject of that ideological system through hailing. There was a couple really good examples that people gave. Obviously the one with both Neo and the Neo and Mr. Anderson, but also the ways that you can also see this in a film like Spirited Away, which someone talked about. The way that when you forget your name, then you are within this control of the system. So that makes you into a subject as opposed to possibly thinking of yourself as an individual. Possibly, because there's another way to think about this too, is that even thinking of yourself as an individual, like I am a human and I have human rights, right? And the UN or whatever, some sort of government declaration says that I have rights. Well, that could also be a form of interpolation. That could also be a sort of hailing that gets done, where you think of yourself as an individual human because you've been hailed by a sort of ideology as well. Okay, so this question of is there any escape from ideology? I think that that's something that many people are already talking about in the forums. I don't have an answer for that. And anyone who does, maybe, you can argue with them, I guess. But, that's why there are some scholars who argue that ideology is everywhere. But at the same time, I think that the way that Marx and Engels are defining it is quite different, in so much that they're saying it's an imaginary relationship, right? And that you can navigate if you are aware in some sort of way. Okay, so what I want to talk about then is this idea of revolution. Okay, so when you hear the term revolution, right, immediately we're thinking, about a political revolution, right? Where there's an overthrow or something, right? But actually, what does the term revolution mean from a sort of a movement perspective? And I mean movement like physical movement, right? A revolution is when something goes around, right? Is when it kind of rotates, right? A full revolution will be 360 degrees, right? It's an entire circular motion, right? And yet at the same time, a revolution is also possible through this kind of spiral movement. So even though you're progressing, you're also revolving around and around and around. So if you think about revolution in that way, then a revolution can also be seen as a sort of way of repeating something. Something going around and happening over and over again. Okay, so the kind of argument that Karl Marx makes then is that revolution is kind of the way that history progresses, and it's not, and not all, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a good or a bad revolution. Revolution is the way that it moves, right? If you think of a dialectic, right, and it's going back and forth, but in a spiral motion, then it is revolving, right? It is revolving around and around and around, even though it's going in this kind of movement. Okay, so this is what Karl Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, and the Communist Manifesto is a sort of you could think of it as a revolutionary document. It is like a kind of clarion call to say, hey, this is the way history works, and now it's time for another revolution. Okay, and he wrote this, for workers, and he was saying that workers need to revolt, and conduct this revolution. Right. So the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. So when I read this, it seems to me, and I'm not a Marxist scholar, so a lot of people argue about interpretations of Marx, but it seems to me that he's saying that the present, and when he was writing this, right, during the Industrial Revolution, the bourgeoisie's specific kind of mode of production, right, was one that was constantly revolutionizing the types of industry. So you even can see that today, right? Like, when people talk about Silicon Valley and tech startups, they're always talking about, we're going to disrupt, right? And that's the way that the bourgeoisie constantly kind of remakes the system of production by introducing new forms that disrupt and revolutionize the instruments of production. So one form of this could be like Uber, right? People talk about Uber or Grab or Lyft as these kind of ride-sharing programs that revolutionize the system that was existing before, of taxis, right? Or something like Airbnb, which is totally disrupting the market for hotel services. Okay, so this is kind of what he means by these systems that get swept away, and new formed ones become antiquated. Before they can ossify. So what happens is that it changes, right? And it keeps changing so fast that something that might kind of be seen as, stable gets kind of disrupted even faster and faster. Okay. So it almost seems like, at least my interpretation of this, is that because of capitalism, the way that capitalism works, it's always trying to revolutionize, right? It's always trying to, it creates this kind of constant innovation that leads to a lot of change constantly, and almost accelerated and intensifying. Okay, however, Marx says is he argues that another form, right, of controlling the means of production is through communism, right, and he's saying a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, and the history of all. And so what Marx is trying to say though is that, because capitalism, the way that it works, kind of like fire, right? It just burns, it burns and burns, right? And it intensifies, right? Eventually, Marx assumed, and not everyone agrees with this, right? Economists might say that, you could go on this system forever. It burns itself out, okay? And so there's another form that will kind of take its place because capitalism is burning itself out, right? And that's communism. And communism, the way that it's kind of understood, in kind of Marxist theory, and I'm not an expert on this, okay, so feel free to correct me in the forums and point out some other readings, okay, but the idea is that if workers control the means of production, then it won't constantly be working towards fulfillment or the accumulation of further capital, okay, so you can have a sort of system where instead of always trying to make more money, instead you just spread around the the bounty, of that production. So for example, let's say you have a factory that makes, or even like a farm, right? You have a farm or a factory farm, okay, which is what most farms are today, right? That makes food, okay. If the workers own the means of production, then all the food that gets made gets spread around the workers, right? And they eat it, okay? And if there's any kind of, I'm not going to get into extra, all right? But let's assume that, it's enough for everyone to eat. However, in a capitalist system, right, the workers will work on the farm, but they don't get paid in food, they get paid in money, right? And then how much they get paid is based upon market rates. And the farm will always try to lower the amount of money that they have to pay to the workers so that they can increase the amount of money that they're making, so that they can then reinvest that money into more ability to make more money, right? So more farmland or more kind of technical things to be used, like more tractors or something like that. So it would always make sense to invest in things like robots or things that will or automation, so that the cost of labor will go down, right? And the kind of surplus that the farm makes will go up, so that then the capitalist or the bourgeoisie can then reinvest that into other things, right? That will increase production, so that always there's this kind of constant growth, as opposed to a communist system where the and always revolutionizing it, right? As opposed to a communist system, which would then, take all that kind of fruits of the labor, literally, and spread it around so people can eat it. Okay. Now, there's a lot of arguments back and forth about this. Okay. Like one of the arguments might be that actually, I'm not an economist, so if I get into these arguments, or into these lines of thought, it might not be that helpful, okay? But I'll just kind of lay out certain kind of critiques that people have, right? One of those might be that without the constant innovation and the kind of drive towards revolutionizing the process, then you get less, you get lower yield. And lower yield means that you can't have as much food available, right? So without, for example, like the capitalist process to increase the amounts of food that get grown, then you can't feed as many people. But then another counter argument to that, so I guess we're doing a dialectical kind of back and forth here, but a counter argument to that would be that the more food you grow, then the more people get the bigger your population, and then the more food you need to grow. So there's no sort of stability because it needs to constantly grow until the people who are needed to grow that stuff are no longer needed. And anyway, so there's constant back and forth, right, about the proper sort of system or what's feasible or what's usable, right? Those of you who are interested in that probably go into studying economics or political science or something like that, okay? But what's important for us in literary and cultural studies is to think about this movement, okay, this political movement, how it's reflected in literature and how its ideas are used in literature, okay, and film or, narrative specifically. So quite obviously, right, this idea of a revolution is very clear in The Matrix, right? So you have, all these people who are, succumb to or are made subjects by the ideology, right? And then in order to change that process, there could be a revolution where you recognize that you are, being exploited, right? And so it's like, let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. So working men of all countries unite. So this is the same thing as like when Neo, at the end of The Matrix, he says to the robots, like, I know you're afraid, but I've come to start the revolution, right? To change the mode of production so that the system no longer works just in that favor. But at the same time, those of you who get a chance to watch The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, you begin to see that actually this type of revolt is built into the sort of system. And this kind of revolution is also the history that's always already kind of the way that things will go through this type of revolution. Okay? So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is don't try to look at this kind of analysis and this kind of arguments about that from a Marxist perspective, not just as like an explanation of what is, but also as a way of thinking about how to analyze a narrative. Okay, one way to think about it is if we're talking about it through a sort of structural perspective, right? When we talked about doing structural analyses of literature or narratives, that there are certain types of tropes or narrative events that kind of happen over and over again. So one of those might be this idea of a revolution, right? That gets built into these kinds of stories. And these revolutions can be generational, So one example would be like, what about the son wanting to kill the father and have sex with and marry the mother, right? This is also a revolution. It's the son taking control, right? And taking on authority. But then there's another revolution that would eventually happen, right? Because if the son does take over for the father, then eventually the son will also become the father. And as the father, he will also face a revolution where let's say the son, for example, right, overthrows the father. and then takes his place. So that's also a form of revolution, right? So you could also see revolution not as like a, like a politically motivated kind of, social upheaval, but kind of the way that history moves, right? Like those who were once weak overthrow the powerful and become the powerful, and then the powerful then get overthrown by the new kind of rebel that comes in and overthrows. Okay, so that's part of the sort of chain of events, you could say, of the dialectic, that moves history. So, the bourgeoisie of the past will get overthrown by, bourgeoisie of the future, right? Just like, Amazon and, Amazon has totally disrupted these major kind of chains, chain stores, like, I don't know, like Sears or something like that. But then one day there will be a new type of, capitalist formation that also overthrows Sears or something. Sorry, also overthrows Amazon, and so on and so forth. Okay, and these kinds of this story of this type of struggle between that is kind of a way to understand narrative. Okay, so that's what I want us to focus on, and that's why I'm teaching, or at least talking about revolution. Not necessarily as an effective political ideology or an effective political movement, but as a way to think about stories and narratives and their politics. Okay? All right, cool. So yeah, that's the Communist Manifesto, which is really interesting. Okay, so I recommend you read it. Okay? Okay, so yeah. So you should have watched The Matrix already and looked at the clips, okay? All right, so now I want to move to talking about the political unconscious, right? So now that we have these kinds of insights from Marxist analysis, where do you go from there? Do you just analyze it by saying, oh, this is an ideology, and this is an example of revolution? Or can we think about it in other ways? Does thinking about, does using a Marxist analysis also enable us to use different ways to analyze literature and narrative, okay? And so one really kind of very famous literary critic and Marxist political theorist is Frederick Jameson. He was and he's a big reason why we talk about Marxism in something like literature, okay, or film, right? He reintroduced Marxist theory into literary studies, right? So when you think about Marxist theory, it's saying, like, what is the material forces? What are the material aspects, material forces, or how does materiality, right, like the physical, influence what it is that you're studying? Now, this is very obvious, right, with the study of history, right? You're like, instead of studying what, this person thought, you would say, what are the kind of, physical things that were going on that influenced, and especially when it comes to resource allocation, right, like money, how does that influence what we understand about history? But then if you think about literature, then how can you analyze, something that's material in the form of literature? And Jameson was one of the first to kind of reintegrate this idea of thinking about the materiality. Like let's say you want to follow the money to do a materialist analysis of literature. Well, you actually can, right? You can really say, it's like, oh, if you think about who stands to benefit from this type of story, right? How does, this type of way of doing things make some people more money than others, or something like that. That is starting to use Marxist theory to think about literature or film, okay? So Frederick Jameson is really famous for kind of reintroducing that and making that a kind of big part of literary and cultural studies. Okay, but remember, when we use Marxism, it's a form of analysis. Okay, it's not just because you might study using Marxist theory. That doesn't mean that you're a Marxist, like a revolutionary Marxist or something like that, or that you're a communist or a socialist or something. Okay, it's much more complicated than that. It's just a way of studying. Okay, and analyzing. Of course, it could be a way of life too. It can be many things. Right. Anyway, okay. So back to Jameson. So some of his famous works are Marxism in Form, 20th Century Dialectical Theories of Literature, The Political Unconscious, which is what we'll be talking about, Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, and Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism. Okay, so this last one, the Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism, is really famous not only is it famous, it's applicable, and really kind of a lot of debates have risen around that in terms of, especially when it comes to the literary and literature and film and narratives produced in places that Jameson might have once considered third world, including places like Taiwan. I'll get into that, okay? Now, one of the most important slogans that Frederick Jameson says is always historicize. Now, I think that this is a really important line to say always historicize, and it really it's amazing that he kind of can distill all of his work into just this one line. Why is it that you would always historicize the work? Okay? Now, when he says historicize, he means when you talk about a text, right? Let's say you talk about a piece of literature. So let's say we talk about The Matrix, for example, right? All of our ways of talking about The Matrix so far have been very much around how does The Matrix demonstrate ideology? How does The Matrix demonstrate, these questions of, class and revolution? How does it help us thinking about Plato's allegory of the cave? Jameson would say that none of this is actual Marxist analysis. You're not historicizing. So what he means by historicize is he would say it's like, when was The Matrix made? Right? It was made in 1999. Right? So that's a historical fact about The Matrix, the film. Where was it made? It was made in Hollywood, in the United States. Right? By who? By the Wachowskis and the Warner Brothers Studios. Right? And so when you begin to historicize, you begin to link the text and its production to the material forces that produced it. So one of the ways to think about it from a Marxist analysis, according to Jameson, then would be like, well, you're talking about The Matrix as if it's some sort of, revolutionary kind of communist work or socialist work or something like that. But in fact, The Matrix made a lot of money. The Matrix is, linked to a lot of multinational capital. Is linked to Hollywood, which is an industry. Okay? And, Warner Brothers, which was still is, I guess, a major kind of production and distribution studio. So by historicizing, you are linking it to these kind of material aspects, and you need to study those. So for Jameson, then, he would say that you are conducting a sort of Marxist analysis simply by historicizing. And you always must historicize in order to draw attention to the material forces that produce the text. Okay? In The Political Unconscious, then, Jameson argues, right, that all interpretation is influenced by politics. Okay? This is important. So he would say, then, that every type of, let's go back to our elephant analogy. Every way that you choose to examine the elephant, whether you're looking at it through its flappy ears, or its, snake-like trunk, or its, rope-like tail, or its, tree-like legs, or wall-like girth, okay? These are all influenced by politics. All of these modes of interpretation are influenced by your kind of positioning in society, okay? So basically, all interpretation is ideological, okay? So he says that the only way to kind of understand this is then you have to, not to understand it, but at the very least to draw attention to those politics, specifically how those politics are influenced by your material resources and your material situation, right? Like, are you in front of the elephant? Are you behind the elephant? Okay? How much money are you getting paid to think about the elephant in a certain way, right? Like, let's say I'm a leather worker. It would behoove me to think that the elephant is just a piece of skin or something like that, okay? So Jameson says that you must always historicize. And you think about how have the historical circumstances of its production shaped the text. And that history is the real. That's the reality, okay? When you say it's like when you can't escape the cave, well, it's like, yeah, you can never get away from the shadows of the walls or whatever, right? But Jameson would say it's like if you historicize and you give as accurate a rendering as you can of the historical situation that you're in, that is the reality. And he would argue that's hidden below the surface of the text, okay? And that the text mediates historical reality, okay? So if we go back to our sort of allegory of the cave, the text, right, is the shadows on the wall, okay? So you're chained up, right? You don't even really know you're chained up, and you're looking at the shadows on the wall, right? Or you can think about it as like, living in the Matrix, right? That's the shadows on the wall. That's the text, okay? But
The text mediates the historical reality. So if you historicize, then you are sort of linking it to the text in some way. Sorry, linking it to the historical reality in some way. So it's important that the text is a representation, right, of physical reality. So what's really kind of unique about what Jameson's doing here is he's bringing together two different types of interpretation. So we got a question in the forums earlier in the semester that asked, how can we do something new? And I said, doing something new is always a combination of the old. Okay? So what Freud says, right, is like, oh, there's an unconscious. There's something below the surface, right? Remember his kind of Freud's notion of the unconscious, right? He uses a metaphor of the conscious and the unconscious. Okay? So he's using a metaphor of there being something above the surface. Well, I don't know what just happened there. Okay. Something above the surface and something below the surface. Okay. So this metaphor is a sort of methodology, right? It's a way of thinking about things. It's a way of thinking about Freud. For Freud, it's a way of thinking about the mind. But Jameson takes this metaphor of the surface and applies it to the text. Okay? And he's saying that this metaphor of surface and depth can be used to understand the economic base as influencing the superstructure. Okay? So take a look at this, right? Imagine you have what's below the surface, right, which determines most of everything which happens above the surface. For Jameson, he's saying that you can look at the base and the superstructure as same. The base is below the surface, right, and the text is above the surface. Now, there is a link because the below the surface shapes and maintains what's above the surface. So according to this type of viewpoint, then, that Jameson is making, something like the Matrix, right, has a very real link to the kind of conditions of production below. So there's no separation. There is a separation between the two, right, but they're linked. And what's below the surface influences the text. Okay? So one thing that, something that Jameson would say then, and you see this in like the Matrix, right, is that, Neo and Trinity and other kind of humans who are in the Matrix, they know that something's wrong. Unconsciously, they sense that that what they see is a lie, right? There's some sort of something below the surface, right, that is influencing the way they understand, okay, what's happening in the Matrix, and that the Matrix is a lie, right? I think Morpheus calls it like an itch, right? There's like an itch, and you keep trying to scratch it, right? But you can't reach it. You know that something's wrong with the world that's around you, right? Okay? So, Jameson would say that this is a form of what he calls the political unconscious, okay? And the political unconscious is a sort of, unconscious awareness, okay, that the economic base is influencing, right, the sort of system that you're in. So by looking for the political unconscious, you can interpret the text as influenced by the political system. Just like a psychoanalyst can interpret the influence of the unconscious in behavior in your dreams, right? You can influence the way that the political system and the economic system is making its influence into the text. Okay? So, think about it like this, okay? Let's say, right, that this is the text, okay? And this is the economic system that's influencing the text. How is it that we can look for how the economic system is influencing that text? So that's why Jameson would say you always need to historicize what's going on at the moment of the production of the text. One really great example that people use quite often is Hong Kong cinema. Okay, so let's say Hong Kong cinema, for Jameson would say it's like, Hong Kong cinema can always be read as an allegory of its political system. So even though you might have a film that seems to have nothing to do with politics, right? A film like, for example, Infernal Affairs. A lot of people talk about Infernal Affairs, right, as a sort of gangster movie. But at the same time, Jameson, and so then Jamesonians, right, so people who interpret that text, and for example this, I highly recommend reading Gina Marchetti's work on Infernal Affairs. You could see Infernal Affairs, the text
as a representation of the political unconscious going on underneath, which is the story of the handover and economic neoliberalism in Hong Kong. So basically, what's happening politically in Hong Kong makes its way into the text. So even though the text may never explicitly say something about, like handover and the 1997 handover, or it might not explicitly say something about, economics, right? And the neoliberal economic system, of low regulation and high economic speed, you can see it in the film by studying it the way that you would as a form of psychoanalysis. So this is something that's really brilliant that Jameson does, is he's saying you can use psychoanalysis to understand politics and economics, okay? And you can interpret the text as a mediation of that experience, okay? So narrative then becomes a socially symbolic act, right? Narrative comes to represent, right, the ways that, society is functioning, okay? So he argues that narrative mediates between the individual and the society. Narrative creates an unconscious totality of real life, and these stories mediate your existence. Another way to see this, right, would be there's some discussion in the forums about how there are poems and other stories, within ceremony, so like a story within a story, right? Those stories within a story could be seen as a form of mediating existence, okay, as a sort of allegory of what's going on in Teo's experience. And you could also go, depending on how deep or how many times up or around you want to go, you could also see Teo's story as a story about American Indian existence, right? Or American or Native American literature, okay? So these levels and this idea of surface and depth, right? This metaphor of what's above and what's below can kind of manifest in many, many ways. So narrative, but at the same time, right, and this is what Jameson's trying to say, all narrative forms have a history. And by studying that history, then you kind of get some sort of glimpse or access to what's real, okay? So even the types of narratives and how they function express the totality. So which say they're historical reality, and it's often economic, okay? So, a lot of the forms that we study have a lot to do with the economics that's kind of behind it, right? Even a film like The Matrix, we could talk about it as a sort of example of revolutionary Marxism, but you could also talk about it, and a Jamesonian analysis would be to talk about it as a way of thinking about Hollywood cinema, and the technological apparatus, the industry itself, what's going on in America and its politics at the time, so yeah, and also how it kind of tries to navigate racial ideology. There's been a lot of different types of analysis of The Matrix that you can look up, okay? So then what Jameson's arguing then is that narratives in their form are always already embody on the unconscious level the socioeconomic circumstances of their time period and production. So it doesn't have to be political on purpose. I think that that's really important to understand, that because it's unconscious, right, the influence of the economic system will always make its way into the text, okay? Because politics shape how narratives can be written and they're told. So all narrative forms are ideological, okay? So then let's talk about another important essay by Jameson is Postmodernism and the Consumer Society. So he argues that artistic production in late capitalism, and that's what he considered to be the current era when he was writing that, which is in the 80s, I guess, 70s and 80s, which is like 50 years ago now. So, are we still postmodern? Are we in a different form? Who knows, okay? And that's something to discuss, and it's not, like, solved or anything, okay? And he argued that during that time, texts reacted against their modern establishment, and they created no longer a difference between high culture and popular culture. Okay, so, during what Jameson considered to be modernism, there was this very clear idea of what is high culture. Whereas popular culture came to be, mixed up with that. Okay? So he would argue then postmodernism is not an artistic, stylistic, or literary movement. Okay? And this is different from what others say, right? Instead, postmodernism is the ideology of form in the present stage of consumer capitalism. Okay?
So postmodern art is not like a literary movement. It's not like expressionism. Postmodern art is the ideology that gets created because we live in a consumer capitalist type of society. So he says that there's different ways you can see that. Okay, so I recommend, if you're interested in this, that to do the reading. Okay, yeah. So let's kind of move on. Okay, another way of thinking about postmodernism is from Jean Baudrillard. And he talks about, and you probably studied this in your other course, right? But he talks about simulacra and simulation. And he would argue that the matrix is, that we all kind of live in the matrix, okay? And everything is a sort of copy of a copy of a copy. So what you really find when you look at the simulacrum, right, is that, and I think some of you are getting to this point in the forums at least, is that if you can never escape ideology and everything is always a sort of construction, then when are you ever not in the matrix? When are you ever not in the cave? Okay? When is your world ever real? Okay? And Baudrillard argues that the simulacrum, okay, is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. The simulacrum is true. Okay? So it's that there is no sort of reality, okay, that you can be separated, that, that is actually real. And so that's where his kind of famous line, "Welcome to the desert of the real," which you see in the Matrix. Okay? All right. An interesting kind of discussion of this notion of the real is the problem with, or not, I don't know if it's a problem, okay? And this is quite complicated. So let me see if I can map this out for you, but kind of quickly, okay? If all of our understandings of knowledge, okay, of what is, okay, is always perspectival, right? So you are never really seeing the whole elephant. You're always looking at it from a certain perspective. You're always interpreting it. And that interpretation is always influenced by politics and political interest. Okay? That means that everything that we can understand is representational. So if everything is representational, an argument then that Baudrillard would make is that actually there is only representations. There is no reality. Okay, there is no truth. All truth is representational. So all truth is based upon a sort of inherent or kind of politicized interest. Okay, and at the same time, those interests become so strong that, and so important, and because it's like ideology, right? It makes reality. So when people talk about like we were talking about like the Matrix, right? The Matrix makes the real. It makes the physical. It makes the kind of physical aspects that, whether it's Neo or Trinity, that they go through. When they die in the Matrix, they die in reality too, because that is also making the real. And so if this process of making and remaking has always been going on, then there's never anything that's separated from that system of representation. Okay, so there's a really great kind of example of this, right, from Jose Luis Borges, who's a oh gosh, I forgot, is he Colombian or Chilean? I don't remember. But Borges, he really I mean, he's a really great writer. I highly recommend you read Borges. Just so fascinating. Okay, but he has a short story called "On Exactitude in Science." And in the story, he talks about a story of an empire. Okay, it's actually really short, so I'm just going to read it to you. So in that empire, the art of cartography attained such a perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and their cartographers' guilds struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that that vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it, that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of suns and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars.
In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. So what happens when the map is so accurate that it actually maps up with the Earth itself, with what it's supposed to be mapping? And here's this kind of like line, right? In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. So if it's inhabited, right, that means that people are living on the map, right? That when the empire falls, the map also falls into disarray. Okay, so the kind of mapping of the world is actually the world. So that is an example, all right, I would say, of a view of Marxist totality. The idea that the physical and the kind of ideological are always influencing each other to the point that there's no such thing as being separate from it. You're never sort of out of the cave. Now, where do we go from there? What does that mean, right? Is it true that all truth is interested? Okay, all truth is politicized. All interpretation is linked to ideology in one way or another. Okay, well, what are the sort of implications of that? And is there any way to get away from that, right? Let's say we're to take the opposite and to say, like, well, what's the use of that theory, right? Like, if a theory describes everything, what does it really describe? Is it even useful at all? Okay, so that's just something to think about, right? So that's it for this lecture. I think you're all ready to do your midterms. So I look forward to reading those. I'm going to post this in the same week as the previous lecture on what's it called? On ideology, because I think they go together really well. But I think you can consider it kind of two separate lessons. Okay. Let me know if you have any questions about the midterm. I think that's it. So I look forward to reading your work and, talking more in the forums. Okay? All right, take care. Bye.